Hello and welcome again to Politics of Southeast Europe, our presentation on violence. The question that I want to pose in this segment is who are the people who participate in violence? Now, we already have the basic insight that was offered in the last segment from Erwin Staub, that violence is a learned behavior, that it is a response to environments that encourage violence, that make violence to appear normal. But this is a point that I want to underline, that the people who participate in violence are not extraordinary people. There is not something about their personal qualities that makes them inclined to participate in violence. And the evidence that I'll give you for this contention, you might say that it's unusual evidence. I am going to give you a poem by Leonard Cohen, who you may know best as a singer. He's not to be confused with the political scientist Leonard Cohen from Canada who wrote about the Balkans. And this is his poem about Adolf Eichmann. I will be quiet for a moment and give you the chance to read the poem. It's not very long. The point that's made here is a fairly simple one, and he's talking about Adolf Eichmann, who was in 1962 kidnapped in Argentina, put on trial in Israel, and executed for his participation in the Nazi genocides. And what was fascinating about Adolf Eichmann, Hannah Arendt wrote about this famously. She developed for him the label of the banality of evil, was the way in which he described organizing the genocide committed by the Nazis as normal bureaucratic activity, as a job. That is, he came to be seen as representing the way in which extraordinary violence can be taken as normal activity that makes sense in a situation in which the victims are dehumanized and that activity is normalized. But what are some other elements that might contribute to this? I want to talk about some other ways in which participation in violence is a response to an unusual situation. And I want to do that with reference to the research that was carried out by Alexandra Milicevic, a sociologist. And Alexandra Milicevic went to Pančevo and looked at two groups of people. She looked at people who refused to participate in the wars of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, that is, draft dodgers, and she looked at volunteers, people who volunteered especially for paramilitary groups and willingly went to participate in the violence. Let's start by talking about the draft dodgers, because there were a lot of them. The estimate is that during the wars of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and Serbia, about 40% of the people who received call-ups for obligatory military service refused to respond to those call-ups. But there were also people who volunteered. And she went and interviewed people who volunteered and asked them what motivated them to do that. And something interesting came out of her interviews. She talks about the wars occurring in an atmosphere in which, at the end of a state socialist regime, there was a process of rapid social change that lasted over a century, and a lot of this change involved gender, especially detraditionalization of gender roles, particularly as they're related to participation in the workforce and the ability to earn, and their retraditionalization, that is the alliance of nationalism with other forces, including conservative political forces and some parts of religion, to reassert traditional gender identities. And her argument is that in this context, reasserting this traditional male gender identity was problematic. It was in fact not possible in times of crisis for people to receive the kind of work that would allow them to earn enough to provide for a family in a way that allows for the exercise of dominance. That is, that gender identity and gender roles, the kind that were being advocated from positions of political power, were unachievable in the environment that existed. They were fraught and they were uncertain, and the intensity of the dissociation between what was promoted through ideology and what was actually possible in every life became more intense because nationalist campaigns were organized around many issues that had a lot to do with gender, like fertility, the argument that there is a competition for biological survival that can be won by members of one national group having more children, um, and uh, um, and and raising them more than members of the other group. And she gets to her interviews, and one thing that you find about the volunteers is that some of the people explained their participation in paramilitary groups and their participation in the war and violence in terms of political goals, the declared goals of what the fighting was about and the national cause and so on. But partly they also explained it as a way of achieving the imposed goals of traditional male gender identity, which were not achievable under regular economic circumstances, but where the possibility of them seemed to be enhanced by participating in a project that was traditionally male, like war, that seemed to be popular and nationally approved, that was endorsed from positions of political power. That is, that they explained their participation in the violence in terms of their inability to achieve the demands imposed by male gender roles in their conditions and in terms of their relationships with their families. Now, this is an argument that probably accounts for some of the participation of volunteers in paramilitary organizations and in the commission of violence, quite possibly not all of it. The reason that I raise it is that it may be theoretically important for us. And why is it theoretically important for us? Because when we want to talk about motivations to participate in violence, the key element that is probably more important than any other is that participation in violence is a response to a social environment, in particular a social environment in which violence is encouraged and normalized, in which the experience of victims of violence is diminished because of dehumanization. And when we look at it this way, we move beyond the relatively simple stories that come out of media and other forms of publicity about ethnic groups and the motivations that are ascribed to ethnic groups. And instead, it allows us to locate the mobilization for violence in the real experience that people have of their lives, in their experience of change, in their experience of uncertainty, in their experience of insecurity, all of which probably taken together contribute to the enhancement of the environment of fear that shifts people from the normal frame to the crisis frame of understanding difference.